September 1944, the outskirts of Brest, France. The morning mist is just beginning to lift off the fields. Inside a reinforced concrete bunker, a German commander presses his face against the cold rubber eyepieces of his binoculars. He is sweating. His hands are shaking slightly as he adjusts the focus. He scans the horizon, and what he sees makes his blood run cold. Tanks, hundreds of them, American Sherman tanks. They are lining the ridge, stretching as far as the eye can see. Their turrets are angled down, pointed directly at his position. Behind them, he sees trucks, jeeps, half-tracks. It looks like the entire American 6th Armored Division has moved in overnight. The German commander drops his binoculars. He grabs the field telephone. He screams orders to his artillery crews. Load the guns, prepare for an immediate assault. We are outnumbered 10-1. The German soldiers rush to their posts. They are terrified. They know what a Sherman tank can do. They know that in a few minutes, that ridge is going to erupt in fire and steel. But if that German commander had waited just 30 seconds longer, he would have seen something impossible. He would have seen a lone American soldier walk out of the woods. The soldier walks up to one of the massive, 30-ton Sherman tanks. He doesn't climb inside. He doesn't check the engine. Instead, he grabs the tank by the front bumper, and with one hand, he lifts the entire machine over his head. He spins it around. He sets it down facing the other way. Then, he dusts off his hands and walks away. The German commander would have blinked. He would have wiped his eyes. He would have thought he was losing his mind, because that tank was not made of steel. It was not made of iron. It had no armor plating. It had no engine. It had no gun. It was made of rubber, and it was filled with air. This was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. But history would come to know them by a different name, the Ghost Army. They were the most unique and the most secret unit in the entire Second World War. On paper, they didn't exist. In the history books, they were invisible for decades. There were only 1,100 of them, but they weren't your typical soldiers. They weren't drafted from farms or factories. They weren't trained to storm beaches or jump out of airplanes. These men were recruited from art schools in New York and Philadelphia. They were painters, architects, set designers, actors, advertising executives. They were the creative minds of America, thrown into the muddy hell of Europe. Their mission was simple, but insane. Their job was to impersonate the United States Army, while the real tanks and the real soldiers were sneaking around the enemy's flank. The Ghost Army would set up right in front of the Germans. They would inflate hundreds of rubber tanks. They would park thousands of empty trucks. They would set up fake kitchens, fake latrines, and fake headquarters. They were a traveling roadshow of deception. Their goal was to draw fire, to make the Nazis waste their ammunition on balloons, to make Hitler's generals believe that the American army was in one place, when really, the knife was coming from the other direction. It sounds like a joke. It sounds like a prank, but for the men of the Ghost Army, it was a terrifying reality. Imagine being a soldier in this unit. You are sitting in a foxhole. Next to you is a Sherman tank. It looks real. It casts a shadow from 1,000 yards away. It looks like a killing machine, but you know the truth. You know that if a German sniper fires a single bullet, that tank won't deflect it. That tank will pop. It will hiss. And it will deflate into a sad pile of rubber on the grass. And you, the soldier sitting next to it, you have no armor, you have no heavy weapons, you have a rifle and a paintbrush. You are sitting in the crosshairs of the most dangerous army on earth, and your only protection is a bag of air. The visual illusion was their masterpiece. They could enter an empty field at dusk, a field with nothing but cows and mud. They would pull their trucks into a circle. They would unload massive bundles of rubber canvas. They would hook up portable air compressors. The engines would cough to life. And then, magic, slowly, the rubber would expand. The turret would rise. The gun barrel would stiffen. The tracks would take shape. In 30 minutes, an empty pasture would transform into a fortified position of an armored battalion. But it wasn't just about inflating balloons. These men were artists. They were perfectionists. They knew that German reconnaissance planes would be flying over. They knew that German spies would be watching with telescopes, so they didn't just place the tanks. They staged them. They used bulldozers to make fake track marks in the mud leading up to the balloons. So it looked like the tanks had driven there. They threw camouflage netting over them. But they left it a little bit loose. They wanted the Germans to see them. They wanted the enemy to find them. It was a high-stakes game of poker, and the Ghost Army was bluffing with an empty hand. But the visual deception was only the beginning, because a tank that doesn't make noise is just a statue, and the Germans were listening to truly fool the enemy. The Ghost Army had to do more than just look dangerous. They had to sound dangerous, and that is where the sonic weapon comes in. November 1944, the Luxembourg border. The nights here are long, they are cold, and they are quiet, too quiet, and that was the problem. The visual illusion of the Ghost Army was perfect. From the air, those rubber tanks looked exactly like 30-ton steel monsters. They cast the right shadows. They had the right markings. But war is not a silent movie. War is loud. A real armored division does not sneak up on you. It announces itself. When a column of Sherman tanks moves, the ground shakes. The treads squeal against the asphalt. The engines roar like angry beasts. It sounds like an earthquake is approaching. If the Germans looked through their binoculars and saw 500 tanks, but heard absolutely nothing, they would know instantly that it was a trap. They would know they were looking at balloons. So, the artists needed a voice. They needed to make the air shake. Enter the 313-second Signal Service Company, the Sonic Deception Unit. These men weren't painters. They were audio engineers. They were the DJs of the battlefield, and they were about to introduce the German army to the loudest sound system in Europe, back in the United States, before they shipped out. These men went to Fort Knox. They didn't go there to train with tanks. They went there to record them. They followed armored columns with wire recorders. The ancestors of the cassette tape, they recorded everything. They recorded the specific sound of a tank cranking its engine in the cold morning air. They recorded the clanking of metal treads on a dirt road. They recorded the sound of trucks shifting gears on a steep hill. They even recorded the voices of American sergeants screaming at their men, swearing, giving orders, building bridges. They took these sounds back to the lab. And they didn't just play them back. They mixed them. They created multi-track audio files. One track for engines, one track for treads, one track for voices. They could simulate an entire army moving north or south or stopping for lunch. They could tailor the soundscape to match the specific terrain they were fighting in. But a recording is useless if the enemy can't hear it, so they built the speakers. These weren't the speakers you have in your living room. These were weapons. They mounted massive 500-pound speakers onto the backs of half-tracks. These speakers were so heavy they had to be reinforced with steel beams. They were powered by massive amplifiers that could generate enough acoustic energy to shatter windows. The range of these speakers was 15 miles. 15 miles. They could project the sound of a heavy tank division so far that a German soldier 3 towns over would swear the Americans were coming for him. But having the technology was one thing. Using it was something else entirely. This was the dangerous game. The sonic teams operated at night under the cover of total darkness, while the rest of the Ghost Army slept. The sound crews would climb into their half-tracks. They would drive forward, past the American lines. Into no man's land, they had to get close, dangerously close. Sometimes they parked their trucks within a few hundred yards of the German outposts. Imagine sitting in that truck. It is pitch black. It is raining. You are alone in the woods. You know that somewhere in the darkness ahead of you, there is a German machine gun crew listening. You turn the dial, you press play. Suddenly, the forest erupts with noise. Clank, clank, vroom. The sound of 100 tanks fills the air. The sound of hammers hitting steel. The sound of men shouting, "Hey Joe, bring that pontoon over here." The audio is crisp. It is terrifyingly realistic. To the German listeners, it sounds like a nightmare. They think a massive American force is building a bridge right in front of them. They think an assault is imminent. The German commander grabs his radio. He screams for artillery support. Target Sector 4. The Americans are crossing the river. Fire, fire, and then the shells start to fall. The Germans unleash hell. They fire mortars. They fire 88mm cannons. They pound the forest with high explosives. They are trying to destroy the tanks they hear. They are trying to kill the soldiers they hear. But there are no tanks. There are no soldiers. There is just a couple of guys in a truck, turning the volume knob up to 11 as the shells explode around them. The sound engineers don't run. They don't hide. They keep the tape rolling because every shell that explodes in that empty forest is a shell that isn't landing on the real American troops 5 miles away. The ghost army soldiers would sit in their foxholes, listening to the bombardment. They would feel the ground shake, and they would laugh. They would look at each other in the dark and smile because they knew the truth. The Germans weren't fighting the U.S. Army. They were fighting a recording. They were fighting ghosts, but the game was getting harder. The Germans were smart. They were starting to wonder why their shells never seemed to hit anything. The ghost army needed to up the stakes. They needed a grand finale, and they were about to get it. At the Rhine River. Winter 1944. The war has frozen over. The ground is hard as iron. The trees are bare skeletons against the gray sky, but while the guns have gone quiet in some sectors, a different kind of war is heating up. A war of whispers, a war of shadows. The ghost army had mastered the visual illusion with their balloons. They had mastered the auditory illusion with their speakers, but to truly fool the German high command, they had to master the human illusion. They had to become actors. The battlefield was their stage, and the script was written on the fly. This was the atmosphere platoon. Their job was to infiltrate the towns and villages near the front lines. These were places where the loyalty of the locals was complicated. There were French resistance fighters, but there were also collaborators, sympathizers, and actual German spies wearing civilian clothes. The ghost army knew the spies were watching. In fact, they counted on it. Picture a small, smoke-filled cafe in a French village. It smells of cheap tobacco and stale wine. In the corner, an old man reads a newspaper. At the bar, a woman wipes down a glass. The door opens. 2 American officers walk in. They look exhausted. Their uniforms are muddy on their shoulders. They wear the patches of the 75th Infantry Division. They order drinks. They sit down. They look around, checking to see if anyone is listening, and then they start to talk. But they talk just a little too loud. "We are moving out tomorrow morning," one of them says. "The colonel says we are heading east, toward the Saar River. It's going to be a bloodbath." The other officer nods. "Yeah, all those tanks. It's going to be hell moving that much armor in the snow." They finish their drinks. They leave. The old man in the corner puts down his newspaper. He slips out the back door. He finds a radio, and he sends a message to Berlin. The Americans are moving east. Large armored force confirmed. The German high command receives the intel. They move their troops to the east to block the attack, but it was all a lie. Those American officers weren't from the 75th Division. They were art students from New York. They had sewn those patches onto their uniforms just an hour ago. They weren't moving east. The real army was moving west. This was the genius of the ghost army. They turned every soldier into a character. They created a special effects costume department. They had crates full of patches for every division in the U.S. Army. General stars, colonel's eagles, sergeant stripes. They would drive their trucks through towns, circling the same block over and over again, but changing the bumper markings each time. To a spy watching from a window, it looked like thousands of vehicles were passing through. They were literally directing a play for an audience of Nazi spies. But the most sophisticated acting didn't happen in a cafe. It happened over the airwaves. This was the spoof radio operation. In 1944, radio was the nervous system of the army. Every order, every movement, every request for supplies went over the air. The Germans had a massive intelligence unit called the Abwehr. They had listening posts all along the border. They intercepted everything, and they were good, terrifyingly good. German intelligence officers could identify individual American radio operators just by the way they tapped the Morse code key. It is called a fist. Just like everyone has a unique handwriting, every telegraph operator has a unique rhythm. Some are fast, some are heavy-handed, some have a little pause after the letter E. The Germans had a file on every American operator. They knew that if they heard Sergeant Smith's fist, that meant the 6th Armored Division was nearby. So, the Ghost Army had to do the impossible. They didn't just have to send fake messages. They had to impersonate the fist of the real operators. The Ghost Army radio men would listen to the real units for hours. They would practice tapping the key until they could mimic the exact style of a specific operator from the real division. It was forgery, but instead of forging a signature, they were forging a sound. They set up their radios in the woods, and the show began. They created entire networks of fake traffic. One operator would tap out a request, command. "This is Baker Company. We are low on fuel. We need 5 tanker trucks at coordinates 349er. Another operator, sitting 50 feet away but pretending to be miles away, would reply, "Copy Baker Company. Fuel is on the way. Hold your position," to the Germans listening in. This sounded like a massive logistical operation. Fuel trucks meant tanks. Tanks meant an attack. The Ghost Army flooded the airwaves with boring, mundane details, requests for socks, reports of engine trouble, happy birthday messages. It was the boredom that made it real. If they only sent important battle plans, the Germans would be suspicious. But no one fakes a request for extra toilet paper, so the Germans believed it, all of it. They drew red lines on their maps. They placed pins where they thought the Americans were massing. They moved their panzer divisions to meet the threat. But when they arrived at the coordinates, they found nothing, just empty woods, quiet snow, and the faint sound of laughter on the wind. The Germans were fighting a phantom, but the biggest performance was yet to come, the grand finale. The stakes were about to get much higher because the Allies needed to cross the Rhine River, and to do that, the Ghost Army would have to pull off the greatest deception of the war. March 1945, the banks of the Rhine River. Germany, this was it. The final barrier for months. The Allied armies had pushed the Nazis back, mile by bloody mile, from the beaches of Normandy, through the forests of the Ardennes, to the very doorstep of the Third Reich. But now, they faced a wall. The Rhine River is deep, it is wide, and the current is fast on the other side. The German army was waiting. They were beaten, battered, and desperate, but they were digging in. They knew that if the Americans crossed this river, the war was over. And a desperate enemy is the most dangerous enemy of all. General Eisenhower had a problem, a massive problem, to invade Germany. He had to send hundreds of thousands of men across that water in small boats. It was a logistical nightmare. If the Germans knew where the crossing was going to happen, they would concentrate every gun, every tank, and every mortar on that one spot. It would be a slaughter. The river would run red with American blood. Eisenhower needed a miracle. He needed the Germans to look left. While he punched them on the right, he needed the Ghost Army. This would be their masterpiece. The operation was code-named Viersen. The plan was simple on paper, but terrifying in reality. The real attack, the real Ninth Army, was going to cross the river at a place called Wessel. The Ghost Army was ordered to set up 10 miles south, at a town called Viersen. Their mission was to impersonate the Ninth Army. Do the math. The Ninth Army had 30,000 combat troops. The Ghost Army had 1,100 artists. They had to make the Germans believe that 30,000 men were massing at Viersen. They had to draw the entire German defense force down to the south, leaving the north open for the real crossing. It was the ultimate gamble. If they failed, the deception would be obvious. The Germans would ignore them and crush the real invasion force at Wessel. Colonel Harry Reeder, the commander of the Ghost Army, looked at his men. They were tired. Their uniforms were worn out. They had been pulling cons since France, but he told them, "This is the big show. This is what we practice for." They moved out in the middle of the night. March 23rd, the trucks rolled into Viersen. The men jumped out and immediately started working. They didn't just have to set up a few tanks. They had to build an entire fake infrastructure for a massive invasion force. In the dark fields, they unrolled the rubber bundles. The air compressors hummed to life. One by one, the Sherman tanks rose from the flat earth. Dozens of them, then hundreds. They arranged them in attack formations. Barrels pointed toward the river, but an army needs more than tanks. They inflated fake trucks. They built fake supply dumps using empty boxes and camouflage nets. They even built a fake airfield. They cleared a strip of farmland. They rolled out L-4 Piper Cub observation planes. These were the eyes of the artillery. If the Germans saw spotter planes, they knew big guns were nearby, but these planes couldn't fly. They were made of wood, canvas, and air. The soldiers propped them up. They spun the propellers by hand when German recon planes flew over, just to add that little touch of realism. But the visual lie wasn't enough. They needed to simulate violence. The Germans knew that before a river crossing. The Americans always softened up the defenses with artillery. So the Ghost Army brought in the flash canisters. This was a special pyrotechnic device. It was basically a bucket of gunpowder with an electric igniter. The sonic trucks would blast the sound of a 155mm howitzer firing. Boom! And at the exact same second, a soldier would hit the button on the flash canister. Flash! A burst of light would illuminate the tree line. To a German observer on the other side of the river, it looked and sounded exactly like a heavy artillery battery firing into the night. They set up dozens of these fake batteries. Flash! Boom, flash, boom. The night was filled with the sound of phantom guns, but the tension was unbearable. The river was only a few hundred yards wide. The enemy was right there. The Ghost Army soldiers could see the German bonfires on the opposite bank. They could hear the German trucks moving. They knew that thousands of Nazi soldiers were staring right at them through binoculars. And all the Americans had to protect themselves were .50 caliber machine guns and inflatable rubber. If the Germans decided to send a single patrol boat across the river to investigate, the game would be up. One poke with a bayonet, and the tanks would deflate. If the Germans realized there were only 1,100 men, they could swarm across the river and wipe them out in an hour. The artists worked through the night. They hardly slept. They kept the sound trucks running. They kept the radios buzzing with fake orders. Move the pontoon bridges forward, prepare for assault at dawn. They were practically screaming at the Germans. Here we are, come and get us. They were inviting an attack on themselves. They were making themselves the target. It was an act of incredible bravery. They were standing in the spotlight, unarmed, daring the enemy to take a shot as the sun began to rise on March 24th. The stage was set. The fake tanks were lined up. The fake guns were flashing. The fake radios were screaming across the river. The German commanders made their decision. They took the bait. March 24th, 1945. The trap snaps shut across the Rhine River. The German High Command has made their decision. They have looked at the reconnaissance photos. They have listened to the radio traffic. They have heard the sonic deception. And they are convinced. They believe that the massive American Ninth Army is sitting right in front of them at Viersen. They believe the invasion is coming from the south. So, they make their move. It is a fatal mistake. The German generals issue the order, all units, converge on Viersen. They pull their panzer divisions away from the north. They rotate their heavy artillery batteries. They move their mortar teams. They focus every gun, every pair of eyes, and every ounce of firepower on the Ghost Army. This is exactly what the artists wanted. They have succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. But now, they have to pay the price, because when you act like a target, eventually you get hit. The Ghost Army soldiers are sitting in their foxholes. They are watching the river. Suddenly, the horizon lights up. Flashes of orange and yellow ripple across the German lines. Seconds later, The sound hits them. A low rumble that turns into a scream. Incoming, the ground shakes as the first volley of German artillery slams into the American positions. Explosions tear through the fields. Dirt and shrapnel fly into the air. The noise is deafening. The Germans are throwing everything they have. They are terrified of this massive army they think they see, so they are trying to destroy it before it can cross the river, but down in the mud. The artists of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops are huddled in their trenches. They are holding their helmets. They are praying. They have no heavy guns to fire back. They have no tanks to hide behind if the Germans decide to charge across the river right now. These 1,100 men will be wiped out in minutes, but they don't run. They stay, and then something happens that would be funny if it wasn't so terrifying. A German 88mm shell screams out of the sky. It is a tank killer, a weapon designed to punch through 4 inches of solid steel armor. It slams directly into the side of an American Sherman tank parked near the tree line. In a normal battle, there would be a massive secondary explosion. The ammunition inside would cook off. The turret would fly into the air. The metal would screech and burn, but here, pop. There is no explosion, there is no fire. The massive 30-ton war machine just sighs. It hisses loudly. The air rushes out, and right before the eyes of the terrified soldiers, the tank begins to melt. The turret droops. The gun barrel goes limp. The tracks collapse. Within seconds, the fearsome weapon of war is nothing but a sad pile of rubber fabric lying on the grass. This is the nightmare scenario. If the Germans see this, if a spotter plane looks down and sees a dead tank that looks like a deflated balloon, the secret is out. They will know it's a trick. They will turn their guns north. So, the artists do something incredibly brave while the shells are still falling, while the shrapnel is still buzzing through the air like angry hornets. A team of soldiers jumps out of their foxhole. They grab repair kits. They grab glue. They grab patches. They sprint across the open field. They run toward the deflated tank. They are under heavy artillery fire, but they aren't carrying bazookas. They are carrying air compressors. They dive onto the rubber pile. They frantically search for the hole. They slap a patch over the tier. They hook up the hose. Come on, come on. The engine of the compressor coughs to life. Slowly, miraculously, the tank begins to rise again. The turret lifts. The shape returns. In the middle of a bombardment, they resurrect the ghost from the other side of the river. The Germans see the tank standing tall again. They think they missed, so they fire again. They pour thousands of rounds of precious ammunition into the empty fields. They are pulverizing plywood. They are murdering grass. And while the ghost army is taking a beating, 10 miles to the north, something incredible is happening. Silence. The real Ninth Army, 300,000 men, pushes their boats into the Rhine River at Wesel. They are expecting a bloodbath. They are expecting machine gun fire. They are expecting the water to turn red. But as the boats hit the far bank, there is nothing. The bunkers are empty. The gun emplacements are unmanned. The German defenders who should have been slaughtering them are 10 miles south, busy shooting at balloons. The real American soldiers climb up the bank. They look around. They can't believe their luck. They begin to build massive pontoon bridges. Tanks start to roll across. Trucks follow. It is the largest amphibious crossing since D-Day. And they are doing it with almost no resistance. Back at headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Prime Minister Winston Churchill are watching the operation. Churchill puts down his cigar. He watches the massive army crossing the river safely. He turns to Eisenhower. "My dear General," he says, "it seems the Germans are looking the other way. Back at Viersen, the shelling finally stops. The sun comes up. The ghost army soldiers peek out of their foxholes. They are covered in dirt. Their ears are ringing. Some of them are wounded, but they look north, and they see the smoke rising from Wesel. They hear the radio reports coming in. The Ninth Army is across. The bridgehead is secure. The road to the heart of Germany is open. The artists look at each other. They look at their battered rubber tanks, full of patch marks. They smile. They didn't fire a single shot. They didn't kill a single German, but they just won the Battle of the Rhine. The Germans realize too late that they have been duped. They try to turn their guns north, but the American tanks are already on their flank. The line is broken. The defense collapses. The Ghost Army begins to pack up. They deflate their tanks. They dismantle their speakers. They roll up the camouflage nets. By the time the real American columns arrive to relieve them, the fields are empty, like they were never there at all. May 1945. The guns finally fell silent across Europe. The Third Reich had collapsed. The war was over. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops packed up their gear. They deflated their rubber tanks for the last time. They dismantled the massive speakers that had terrorized the German Knights. They burned the fake patches and the counterfeit documents. They were ready to go home. They were heroes. By conservative estimates, their deceptions had saved the lives of 15,000 to 30,000 American soldiers. They had played a critical role in the victory at the Rhine. They had fooled the smartest military minds in Germany. They deserved a parade. They deserved headlines. They deserved to be carried on the shoulders of the men they had saved. But they got none of that. Instead, they got a final order: silence. The Pentagon made a decision. The techniques developed by the Ghost Army were too successful. They were too dangerous. The Cold War with the Soviet Union was just beginning. The American military leaders realized that they might need to fool the Russians just like they had fooled the Germans. If the world knew that America had an army of balloons and sound trucks, the trick would never work again. So, the files were stamped top secret. The existence of the unit was erased from the public record. The 1,100 men of the Ghost Army were told to keep their mouths shut. They were told that if they spoke about their mission, they would face court-martial, even prison. So, they went home and they lied. They returned to New York, to Philadelphia, to Ohio. They reunited with their wives. They held their children who had been born while they were away. And when their families asked them, "Daddy, what did you do in the war?" they couldn't tell the truth. They couldn't say, "I was an actor," or "I was a sound engineer," or "I spent the war painting fake bumper markings on Jeeps," because that sounded crazy, and it was illegal to say. So they made up stories. They said, "I was in the infantry," or "I blew up tanks," or simply, "I was a clerk. I pushed papers." They swallowed their pride. They let other men take the glory. They carried the secret of their service like a heavy stone in their pockets for 40 years. They went back to their lives, and this is where the story gets even more incredible, because these men weren't just soldiers. They were artists, and the creativity that they had used to save lives in Europe exploded when they got back to America. Many of them became legends, but nobody knew they were Ghost Army veterans. Bill Blass, the world-famous fashion designer who defined American style, he was in the Ghost Army. He spent the war inflating rubber tanks. Ellsworth Kelly, one of the greatest painters of the 20th century, he was in the Ghost Army. He later said that the camouflage patterns he designed during the war influenced his abstract art. Art Kane, the famous photographer, they were all there. The men who shaped American culture in the 50s and 60s had shaped the battlefield in the 40s, but they kept the secret. They would meet for reunions in quiet hotels. They would laugh about the time a cow tried to eat a rubber tank. They would show each other the sketches they had made in their diaries, but outside that room, silence. It wasn't until 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended, that the Pentagon finally declassified the files. The world was shocked. Historians looked at the documents and couldn't believe what they were reading. They realized that entire chapters of the history of World War II had to be rewritten. Battles that we thought were won by firepower were actually won by stagecraft. The Ghost Army veterans were old men by then. Many had already passed away, but for the survivors, it was a relief. One veteran told a reporter, "I finally told my wife the truth last week. She looked at me and said, 'You mean you weren't blowing things up? You were blowing up balloons?' He smiled and said, 'Yes, dear,' and it worked. But recognition came slowly. It took another 20 years of lobbying. It took a documentary film. It took a dedicated group of families pushing Congress. Finally, in March of 2024, in a ceremony at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., the Ghost Army was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. It is the highest civilian honor in the United States. Only 3 of the original veterans were still alive to attend the ceremony. They were over 100 years old. They sat in their wheelchairs, they wore their uniforms, and they finally heard the applause they had earned 80 years ago. They were the masters of the art of war, quite literally. They proved that imagination is just as lethal as ammunition. They proved that you don't always need a bigger gun to win a fight. Sometimes, you just need a better story. They were the army that wasn't there, and because of them, thousands of young men came home who otherwise would have died on the fields of Europe. If this story blew your mind, do me a favor, hit that like button. It helps us rescue these forgotten stories from the archives, and hit subscribe. We are digging up the most incredible military secrets every single week. Let me know in the comments below, if you had to choose, would you rather fight with a rifle or with a paintbrush? I'm curious to see what you think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.